This is a video from Aziz Muhamat on Manus Island, Papua New Guinea.
My name is Aziz and I have been detained on Manus Island for 4.5 years by the Australian government. I have seen 6 of friends die because of violence and medical negligence. We have been attacked by Navy and police, and we have witnessed abuse by the Australian government paid guard. We are refugees. All we want is a freedom in a safe country, not necessarily Australia. For example, somewhere like Canada, New Zealand, or United States. My question to the panel, how long will Australia keep us here in danger?
Start with Gillian Triggs.
Well, thank you for this question. It's marvellous that you can communicate with us. It's a tragedy that you've been there 4.5 years or more. Some people I've met in detention centres have been there for 7 years. I think the solution must be now evacuation. It's becoming unsafe, it's becoming unstable. The reports are coming in of the concerns of the local community. And perhaps I could say that very briefly that one of the concerns also is that the peoples on the island of Manus have a cultural identity. They have ways of behaving and social behaviour, and they see these men and their engagement in the community as a real threat to them. And that has created this tension. But that perhaps is an explanation as to why there's now a rising concern about civil tension on the island. But I think we really do have to now come to terms with the fact that we need to bring these men home, in my view. We need to bring them to Australia. It's a difficult decision for both political parties, but I think the inhumanity has reached a level where we, as a nation, we have to respond. I think we're ashamed of this policy. It's not Australian. It's seriously in breach of our international obligations. And I think the point that needs to be understood and the mythology that needs to be unravelled is that detaining these men on Manus, 600 or 700, plus 40 children in detention on Nauru with their families and other children settled on the island. This is not stopping boats, and it's not saving lives at sea. Well, you don't need to do one to do the other. It's possible to protect our national borders. It's possible to stop drownings at sea. But we can never, in law, use the lives of others for deterrence, even if that were a real deterrence, and it almost certainly isn't. So I think we have to come back to the values that we've espoused right from the days of the United Nations Charter and the Human Rights Declaration, right up to the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, where we started then to regress in relation to many of these human rights principles. I think it's a tragedy for this young man.
Thank you. Erica Betts,
yeah.
Can I just pick up on a point that Gillian Triggs just made there? Is Australia using the lives of others, people who have not committed a crime, as a deterrent?
Well, what I find strange in this debate is that people would seek to give advantage to those that have money, that can afford to pay people smugglers to assist their cause, bypass safe haven after safe haven, and we then say they ought to be given priority, as opposed to some that I have personally visited in Western Thailand who haven't been there just for 4.5 or 7 years, but for 20 years waiting for resettlement, who don't have the money, or they are determined not to engage criminals to advance their cause.
But Eric, as a matter of principle, you wouldn't have used that argument in the 1930s to Jewish people fleeing Nazism who used and paid people smugglers.
But they went to their first port of safe haven. They were not forum shopping. And with refugees, and I have spoken to many of them, both overseas and in Australia, and they say the first port of call where they are given safe haven is what they want, is what they need. And the one argument I still cannot overcome is, why would you give priority to people that have never set foot in a refugee camp and have the money and the wherewithal to pay a criminal people smuggler to advance their cause over people that don't have either the moral compass or the money.
Okay, very briefly, on behalf of the person who...
Can I quickly also argue very strongly that we did stop the boats. People said it couldn't happen. We did stop the drownings at sea and the deaths at sea, and it was because of the determined action of the government, of which I'm very pleased to have been part of, because that has meant we can now have an intake of refugees into our country based on one factor alone, and that is need and not capacity to pay criminal people.
All right, I'll pass it up, Kate.
Two things. In my line of work, you find that it's the serious criminals with money. They come in, they buy false passports, false certificates. They come in business class. They don't come in via, a people smuggler on a rickety boat. And the second thing is that why won't we take up New Zealand on their offer to take 150 refugees? Why would that be so terrible for us to do that?
Well, because as I understand the circumstances, once you become a New Zealand citizen, entry into Australia then becomes very easy. But our gentleman who was on the program indicated that he was more than willing to be resettled in the United States, and that is one agreement that
he also mentioned
Trump,
New Zealand.
President Trump,
yeah,
but we have an agreement.
Pretty much saying...
Can I finish, Tony?
The president... Well, I know he can't respond.
Right.
No, you can. I'm going to come
Thank you.
I'm just making the point that he can't respond for himself. So I'm just coming back to some of the points he made. He mentioned a number of countries, and I think the plea here is, can we go anywhere but this?
And he can go to the United States as part of the deal that President Trump has agreed to fulfil, one that Obama made.
All right, Lisa Singh.
Well, I mean, I say to Aziz that it is absolutely shameful that the Australian government has treated you in this way, that you have been left languishing for years on end, indefinitely in detention on Manus Island. And we're talking about not just you, Aziz, but some 2,000 men, women and children that have been treated appallingly by this Australian government. It should never have come to this. There were other options.
Lisa,
if the government reached out and started to look at those options, like New Zealand, that's currently on the table. I mean, it's absolutely amazing that you have a third country settlement option in New Zealand, an offer that was made under the previous Conservative New Zealand government and now under the Labor New Zealand government, and yet Malcolm Turnbull and Peter Dutton are refusing to take it up. They are choosing instead to not resolve these issues and let these men languish, and the women and children that have been on Nauru. Look at the harm that has been caused, the deaths that have occurred, the suicides that have occurred. Look at the self-harm that's been done to children that Gillian's reported about and then being, attacked by the government for doing so.
And who started offshore detention?
Children that have self-harmed, that have been abused, that are suffering mental illness. Is this the kind of country that we want to be? I mean, I spent some time in the UN last year, and this was the one issue that continually came up when I said I was Australian. That, you're the country that treats refugees really badly.
Oh, that's just false. This
is not the country we want to be. Now, yes, it may have been that it was started under a Labor government, and Gillian's report into the...
It may have been. I mean, it was.
It was. No, Tony. No, that's fine. Yeah. It may have been the fact, right, as it was, that we started the processing on Manus Island and Nauru, but there's been no processing, Tony.
Can I just ask, are you ashamed of the process that was put in place by a Labor government that began the offshore detention system?
I think if we were to reflect on where we are now, that this is not the point that we would have agreed to have been at. And I don't think that ever was the intention. Actually, I know it wasn't the intention. And Kevin Rudd has said that recently even, that it was about processing. There's been no processing. Let's face it. I mean, you've got options on the table and the government's refusing to take them up. What does that say? What does that say about our government? Do they want people to die? Do they want people to continue to suffer? Because it looks like it.
Okay. That is highly offensive. That is highly offensive.
Well, what do you call it, Eric?
No government seeks to have this situation. But Lisa, when we won in 2013, how many people were in offshore detention, courtesy of Labor? How many are in offshore detention today? Thousands less, and you know it. We are slowly but surely dealing with the legacy issues left to us by the Australian Labor Party
You've
government.
got a human rights catastrophe
I'm going to interrupt both of you for a second because I'm going to come to Simon, and Gillian wants to make a point as well. Go ahead.
Look, I think it's a mistake to infer intention, and particularly when it comes to the ill intention that Lisa is talking about there. Of course the government is trying to look after people like this, and for you to suggest that the government's going out of its way to make life more difficult for people who are in detention, I think really is obviously unfair. You know, it's not. It's just so clear.
There's so much evidence to the contrary.
This
program is designed to break these people and to send them back. And there's so much evidence.
That is just a ludicrous
There's a lot of evidence to this.
That is
Can we just hear? If I could just.
Why isn't the media allowed to report on this properly? Why are we not allowed access?
Excuse me, how did Aziz get onto this program? Please, Kate.
Well, I think, and we really...
Can you just finish your point, Gillian? You were halfway through a sentence.
We're not allowed to go there.
So you were halfway through a sentence. Go ahead.
Well, I think the discussion... Sadly, every time you have this, a man like this explaining his problem, looking at the inhumanity, you get a debate about whether it was Labor or whether it was the Liberal Party, who's responsible, who isn't responsible, and you get this to and fro. The reality is that we've got human lives in these detention centres.
And you were so deathly silent during the Labor government.
Well, that is not true. I gave many reports which you didn't read, unfortunately. No, I can...
You denied...
No, I can document those.
You denied talking to Labor
report
ministers of immigration to a Senate committee. You then said you couldn't
That is absolutely
recall,
not true.
And
but let me say,
you
it's not about the
indicated you
politics.
had spoken.
It's about the
why
lives
did you
of
only
these people.
inquire into offshore detention once they were being emptied under our government?
No,
Eric, you've made that point. I just want to hear the response.
Labor and Liberal. It's just that we accepted the findings and you didn't.
When we started that inquiry, or when Labor lost the election and the current government went in, there were about 1,100 children in detention. And 5 months later, there were still 1,100 children in detention. And that is why we embarked on the inquiry. And I can say inquiries don't look into the future. Inquiries look into the past, and that past was predominantly Labor. And it was very interesting that Labor did take it on the chin, but of course, ultimately, it included the difficulties with the current government. Most of the children were released by the time the report was completed. I think there are about 200 left. But the tragedy is there are still 200 children in community detention in Australia, and there are about 190 children on Nauru, 40 of them in detention. One of the difficulties is the secrecy that's been raised, but another is that those social workers, teachers, service providers can't speak up about this. There's a criminal penalty.
Well, they're maligned also by the government. I mean, your report, Gillian, wasn't the only one. There was the UNICEF and Save the Children report. And what happened there? The government, you know, attacked the Save the Children workers and you know, claimed that they were actually telling people to self-harm, for goodness sake. I mean, every time there's been some kind of investigation or advocacy into what is going on in offshore detention or in detention centres, the government just goes into attack mode rather than actually taking the recommendations on board. And we've had advocates there just in recent times, World Vision, Oxfam and the like, again revealing what it's like on the ground. And the fact is that the facts speak for themselves. Things are inhumane. There is a human rights catastrophe and the government doesn't want to deal with it. It wants to just put its head in the sand.
Can we at least celebrate that the boats have stopped, that the criminals have been put out of business, and we can have an orderly intake of refugees based on need?
OK, I'm going to... That's a final point for that part of the discussion. We've got to move on. This is Q&A. It's live. It's interactive, as you can see.